In this second lesson, we will see how Plantinga answers at some of the main critiques raised against the ontological argument. Particularly, we will see the Kantian critiques to the ontological argument. And there are two main objections that Kant raises against the argument. The first is about the meaning of the existential proposition, while the second claims that the existence is not a real predicate. Let's see the first one. Plantinga takes directly the page of the Critique of Pure Reason, in which Kant write this critique. The critique is this: if, in an identical proposition, I reject the predicate while retaining the subject, a contradiction results. I therefore say that the former belongs necessarily to the latter. But if we reject subject and predicate alike, there is no contradiction, for nothing is then left that can be contradicted. For example, to posit a triangle and yet to reject its three angles is self-contradictory. But there is no contradiction in rejecting the triangle together with its three angles. The same holds true of the concept of an absolutely necessary being. If its existence is rejected, we reject the thing itself with all its predicates, and no question of contradiction can then arise. Then Kant remarks, there is nothing outside it that would then be contradicted, since the necessity of the thing is not supposed to be derived from anything external, nor is there anything internal that would be contradicted, since in rejecting the thing itself, we have at the same time rejected all its internal properties. Another example. God is omnipotent is a necessary judgment. The omnipotence cannot be rejected if we posit a deity, that is an infinite being. For the two concepts are identical, but if we say there is no God, neither the omnipotence nor any other of its predicates is given. They are one and all rejected together with the subject, and there is therefore not the least contradiction in such a judgment. For I cannot form the least concept of a thing which, should it be rejected with all its predicates, leaves behind a contradiction. So, now Plantinga asks, what is Kant saying with this objection? According to Plantinga, Kant is not so clear in explaining what's the meaning of existential proposition and why it should not be considered as necessary. In fact, Plantinga says that there are two ways to read these Kant critiques. In the first way, he says that Kant, the meaning of the critique, is that no existential proposition is necessarily true. Otherwise, the other possible meaning of this critique is that no existential proposition is analytic in its narrow sense. A proposition is analytic when the predicate is already included in the subject, as we have seen it with the example of the triangle. The triangle has three angles is an analytic proposition because the property, the predicate to have three angles is already included in the subject, in the triangle. But if is this the meaning of the Kantian critic, it is not so founded. It's a weak critic in Plantinga's opinion, because Saint Anselm has never hold that his proof demonstrate the existence of God by the simple definition of him. So the Kant critics that want to accuse the proof to be a circle, to be a petitio principii, it's a very weak critic, because the true proof, the Anselmian proof, does not require that God's existence is an analytic proposition. Saint Anselm doesn't want to give existence to something, to God, in an analytic way. It's not enough to say, for definition, God is endowed with necessary existence, so God necessarily exists in an analytic way. So if it is the meaning of the Kantian critics, it is not very strong. So probably Kant means the second. So it means that no existential proposition is necessarily true. What about this case? According to Plantinga, this possible thesis, on the contrary, is too strong. That is, when Kant say that rejecting the existence of a thing we will never fall in contradiction, that is, there is never a logical auto-contradiction in denying the existence of a thing, it is a too strong position that Kant himself finishes to disprove. In other parts of his philosophical system, it's the same Kant that disproves this thesis, because the consequences of this thesis are too heavy, too strong, and Kant himself does not bear the consequences of this thesis. And Kant remarks, nothing internal to God makes contradiction the negation of God's existence, and there is nothing external to God that make that existence contradictory. But I repeat, it is a too strong disposition. It is this thesis is too strong. And Plantinga makes notice that there is a case in which Kant disproves this thesis. For example, the mathematical proposition. Kant claims that the mathematical propositions are true and are necessarily true. That is, their negation is auto-contradictory. So, these mathematical propositions are often existential. For example, we can say it exists a prime number between 17 and 20. Or, another example, the successor of 6 is greater than 5. In these cases, we are talking about mathematical propositions which are considered necessarily true and which are existential too. When we say that it exists a prime number between 17 and 20, we are saying that it exists the number 19. Now, let's stop one moment. These counter-critics that Plantinga objects to Kant is very interesting, but in my opinion, it's not so founded, because when we are talking about the existence of numbers, of abstract object, this kind of existence is very, very controversial. It's very problematic, because in a Platonic point of view, such as the Plantinga position, there is no problem. We can speak of numbers, and there is a kind of existence of this kind of objection that is an ideal existence, an abstract existence. But probably Kant would not agree with this position, with this conception. Probably Kant would claim that there is not such an existence, the existence of abstract object or of the numbers in itself, in themselves. So, probably Kant would not agree with Plantinga about this point, and this critics is a little weak. According to me, these critics, this Plantinga critic, can be reformulated in another way, and I refer to Saint Anselm, because Saint Anselm, in his discussion with Gaunilo, has treated some of these kind of problems, some of questions that are similar to these we are seeing now. So now it's not the place to treat in a deep way the thought of Saint Anselm about these questions, but I just take an example inspired by Saint Anselm. Let's take a pen. So we can say that this pen exists. It is endowed with necessary existence? Of course not. It is a contingent object. But in the while it is existing, during the time it exists, we must say, we have to say that it exists. While it is existing, its existence is necessary. We cannot say that this pen that exists does not exist. It would be a contradiction. So in this way, there is, we can talk about propositions that are necessarily true and that are existential propositions. It's just an example, but it gives us the idea of the kind of solution that probably Saint Anselm would have proposed to this kind of problems. So, in this way, we can see that there is a solution to the Kantian critics, which is, in my opinion, a little stronger with respect to the Plantinga's one. Now, let's see the second Kantian objection, the second famous Kantian objection, the one that claims that existence is not a real predicate. Plantinga takes the pages of the critiques of the pure reason, in which Kant explains these theses. I read: being is obviously not a real predicate. That is, it is not a concept of something which could be added to the concept of a thing. It is merely the positing of a thing or of certain determinations as existing in themselves. Logically, it is merely the copula of a judgment. The proposition God is omnipotent contains two concepts, each of which has its object, God and omnipotence. The small word is has no new predicate, but only serves to posit the predicate in its relation to the subject. If now we take the subject, God, with all its predicates, among which is omnipotence, and say God is or there is a God, we attach no new predicate to the concept of God, but only posit the subject in itself with all its predicates, and indeed posit it as an object that stands in relation to my concept. The content of both must be one and the same. Nothing can have been added to the concept, which expresses merely what is possible by my thinking its object through the expression it is as given absolutely. Otherwise stated, the real contains nothing more than the merely possible. And now Kant makes the famous example of the thalers. 100 real thalers do not contain the last coin more than 100 possible thalers. For as the latter signify the concept and the former the object and the positing of the concept, should the former contain more than the latter, my concept would not in that case express the whole object, and would not therefore be an adequate concept of it. My financial position, however, is affected very differently by 100 real thalers than it is by the mere concept of them, that is, of their possibilities. For the object, as it actually exists, is not analytically contained in my concept, but is added to my concept, which is a determination of my state, synthetically. And yet, the conceived 100 thalers are not themselves in the least increased, so to acquire an existence outside my concept. By whatever and by however many predicates we may think a thing, even if we completely determine it, we do not make the least addition to the thing when we further declare that this thing is. Otherwise, it would not be exactly the same thing that exists, but something more than we had thought in the concept, and we could not therefore say that the exact object of my concept exists. If we think in a thing every feature of reality except one, the missing reality is not added by my saying that this defecting thing exists. So, as we can see, in this passage, in this page, Kant expresses the famous critic. But once again, Plantinga thinks that this page is not so clear. Why? Because Plantinga asks what's the concept, the content of a concept, and what's the content of an object. According to him, Kant is not so clear in explaining this difference. So, we can suppose that perhaps Kant means, what Kant means is something like this. The content of a concept is the set of properties a thing must have to fall under or to be an instance of that concept. That is, the content of a concept is more general, is a more abstract idea that is more generic. While the content of an object, on the other hand, is the set of property that an object has. And that is, the content of an object is something more specific. We can do, and Plantinga does, an example about this. The idea, the concept of the tallest man of Boston. If we take the content of the concept, the tallest man of Boston, we have a more generic idea. So there is in fact just one property to be the tallest of the city. But the real object, that is the real man in Boston, which is the tallest, has many more properties. It could be, I don't know, he could be married, perhaps he has blonde hair or blue eyes and so on. So the content of the object contains much more than the content of the concept. And with this example, Plantinga is saying that it's not always true, as Kant says, that the content of the object must be the same as the content of the concept. Kant could answer in another way. He could say, there are some concepts which are the whole concept of an object. We can say not the concept of an horse in general, for example, but the concept of that specifically horse. The concept of a horse in general can be black, brown, white, but the concept of that horse is it has all the properties that that horse has. So it is determined in all its properties. Now, what Plantinga answers to these possible counter-critics. He says that even if we consider the whole concept, the critic is also invalid. Why? Because we can, for example, imagine the whole concept of this famous Taj Mahal, which has the property to be pink, to have marble pink. So we think the whole concept with the property to be pink. What happens if we diminish the whole concept of the property to be pink? We can think about the Taj Mahal not pink. So in this way, Plantinga is showing that even the whole concept in our mind can be diminished or added of some properties. And if we can do that with the property to be pink, why shouldn't we make the same thing with the property of to be existent? In other words, why we should consider the existence something different than all the other properties? So we can see that Kantian critic that is proposed to be universally valid is not so universal, because Kant proposes it under the premise that we accept that existence is in some ways different with respect to all the other predicates. If we do not share these premise, we can reject the Kantian critics too. So we can see that in this way the two main Kantian critics are not so strong, are not so universally valid as Kant proposed to us. And Plantinga has shown in this way that they can be founded. It's not they are not totally unsound, but they are not so strong, and we can escape from them by sharing some other premises different of the premises that Kant has proposed. In the next lessons, we will see another possible interpretation of the proof that will be in some way that will have some relationship with these critics, but that will be able to go on over them in another different way.